What if the thing that finally breaks Putin's grip on power isn't a missile, isn't a battlefield defeat, but a cardboard box that never arrives? Right now, across Russia, ordinary people are opening an app, tracking a package that should have shown up days ago, and slowly realizing something the Kremlin never wanted them to feel. The war has finally reached their front door. Before we go further, if you want to understand exactly how a warehouse fire in the middle of Russia could end up mattering more than a battlefield loss, hit subscribe, tap that like button, and share this with someone who still thinks this war only affects soldiers on the front line. It doesn't anymore. Let's break down exactly how this happened, piece by piece. New polling data just came out, and it shows Putin's approval rating sitting at its lowest point since this war began. 4 straight weeks of decline, a drop of more than 5 percentage points in just a single month. Nearly a 10% slide over 3 months. And here's the detail that actually matters most. Even Russia's own state-controlled polling institutions, the ones built specifically to cushion the Kremlin from bad news and quietly smooth over uncomfortable numbers, can no longer hide what's happening underneath the surface. When even the loyal, carefully managed numbers start admitting the decline is real, you know the underlying frustration runs far deeper than any single poll could ever fully capture on its own. Across Russian social media, people are posting direct, unfiltered appeals, some accusing Putin outright of destroying the country for a war they say nobody actually wanted or asked for. Military commentators, veterans, and public figures who once treated the Kremlin as completely untouchable are speaking with a bluntness that would have been unthinkable just a year or two ago. And reports have surfaced suggesting Putin himself has tightened his personal security, cut back on public meetings, avoids his usual residences, and spends long stretches of time inside secure bunkers, personally micromanaging details of the war that a leader with this much power shouldn't need to touch directly at all. That kind of behavior doesn't suggest a man simply worried about a dip in popularity. It suggests something closer to genuine fear. In a political system built entirely around one man's authority, a falling approval rating stops being just a bad headline buried in a news cycle. It becomes a personal survival problem. And when survival becomes the concern, history shows us exactly where that kind of pressure can eventually lead, no matter how powerful the man at the center appears from the outside. So what actually caused this collapse? What's the real spark behind numbers this bad, this consistently, week after week? The answer isn't a battlefield defeat. It isn't a lost city or a failed offensive splashed across international headlines. It's something far more personal and, honestly, far more clever than anything we've seen from either side throughout this entire war. Ukraine found a way to bring this war directly into the daily life of ordinary Russians, who have spent years believing they were completely insulated from it, protected by distance, by state media, and by a government that promised their lives would remain untouched no matter what happened on the front lines. The centerpiece of this shift is a campaign targeting the warehouses of Russia's largest online retailer, a company so deeply woven into everyday Russian shopping habits that it functions almost like the country's version of a major delivery service everyone quietly relies on without ever thinking twice about it. At least 9 of its major logistics facilities have reportedly been struck across multiple regions. Early estimates suggest more than a quarter of the company's entire logistics capacity has been damaged or destroyed in the process. A staggering figure for a company this size operating across an entire country. Here's why that number matters so much more than it might sound at first glance. This retailer isn't just a convenient shopping app people use occasionally for small purchases. It's embedded into the daily rhythm of ordinary Russian life, and it supports hundreds of thousands of small independent merchants who depend entirely on its warehouse network to store and ship their products to customers across the country. When one of these warehouses burns down, ordinary customers experience something mildly annoying, a delayed package, a late delivery notification popping up on their phone. But for the small business owners who had their entire inventory sitting inside that exact warehouse at the moment of the strike, the outcome isn't annoying at all. It's devastating, immediate, and often financially fatal. And it gets worse from there. The retailer has reportedly stated it won't compensate merchants for property destroyed specifically as a result of Ukrainian strikes, treating it as an uninsurable act of war rather than a standard business risk, which means small business owners aren't just losing a delivery window or a few days of sales. They're losing their entire inventory, their entire investment, sometimes their entire livelihood built up over years with no safety net whatsoever standing behind them when the fire finally goes out. For years, the Kremlin's implicit promise to its own population was simple and consistent. This war would stay far away, confined to a distant front line most Russians would never personally see, hear, or feel in their own neighborhoods. That promise becomes impossible to keep once the country's biggest distribution centers start burning down across multiple regions, one after another, with seemingly no way to stop it and no clear end in sight. And that's exactly why this particular campaign is quickly becoming one of the most politically consequential strategies Ukraine has run throughout this entire war. Arguably more consequential than several major battlefield operations combined. Here's the deeper logic behind why this specific tactic cuts so much sharper than anything that came before it. Russia, as the country that started this war, can only keep fighting for as long as its own population remains willing to tolerate the costs attached to it, whether those costs are measured in soldiers, money, or daily comfort. Strikes on oil refineries do real strategic damage, absolutely, and nobody disputes that. But that kind of damage gets absorbed first by the state itself, and by large corporations with deep enough pockets in government, backing to weather the initial financial shock without immediate collapse. Fuel shortages do disrupt ordinary daily life significantly, and they do generate genuine social frustration that shows up in polling and public commentary. But for most ordinary Russian MOS, a fuel shortage remains an inconvenience, a frustrating wait in line, not a financial catastrophe that wipes out their savings and their business overnight. Warehouse strikes work completely differently, and that difference is exactly what makes them so uniquely effective at generating lasting political consequences. Small and medium-sized merchants typically pour nearly all of their available capital directly into the goods sitting inside these centralized distribution centers, often borrowing money or investing years of savings into inventory meant to sustain their business through an entire season. When those goods vanish in a fire overnight, the owner doesn't just lose some inventory sitting on a shelf somewhere. They lose their revenue, their customer relationships built patiently over years of careful work, their reputation in a competitive market, and in many cases, their entire ability to keep operating as a functioning business at all going forward. And the damage doesn't stop with that single merchant standing alone. It ripples outward immediately, hitting suppliers who no longer have anyone left to sell to, transport companies who no longer have anything left to move across the country, employees who suddenly find themselves without a paycheck at the end of the month, and consumers who now face fewer choices and higher prices for whatever inventory still remains available anywhere nearby. Millions of ordinary Russians, who have spent years quietly telling themselves this war has nothing to do with their daily lives, are now starting to feel its consequences directly in their own wallets, in their own communities, among their own friends and neighbors. This new wave of economic pressure is landing at possibly the worst possible moment for the Kremlin, right as Russia's broader economy is already stretched, dangerously thin by the combined weight of military production demands. The accumulated cost of years of international sanctions, ongoing manpower shortages pulling workers away from civilian industries, rising inflation eating steadily into household savings, and what analysts are now calling the worst fuel crisis Russia has experienced throughout this entire war, a crisis already generating real anger before a single warehouse ever caught fire. Strikes on refineries have already created serious shortages and pushed prices upward for ordinary consumers standing in line at gas stations, while simultaneously weakening the government's own revenue streams at precisely the moment those revenues matter most for sustaining a costly, ongoing war effort. Now, on top of all of that existing pressure, the destruction of these logistics hubs is threatening ordinary civilian commerce as well, and it's already producing open public criticism of the Russian government in spaces where that kind of criticism was once considered far too dangerous to voice out loud. And here's the part that should genuinely worry the Kremlin most of all, more than any single number released this week. The true scale of this damage hasn't even fully arrived yet, and won't for months. As business bankruptcies spread steadily across the country, they'll reduce employment, shrink tax revenue, weaken consumer spending, and erode public confidence even further than it already has been eroded. All of that will eventually force the state to spend even more money simply trying to stabilize its own home front. At the exact same moment, it's still trying to fund an expensive, grinding war effort with no clear endpoint anywhere in sight. The political danger facing Putin right now is compounding, layer stacking directly on top of layer, each one making the next one heavier to carry. The fuel crisis alone was enough to erase more than 5 percentage points from his approval rating in a single month, dragging his numbers down to their lowest point recorded throughout the entire war. Now, burning warehouses threaten to accelerate that decline even further, because they transform something that once felt like a distant, abstract, strategic disruption happening somewhere far away into something intensely personal, something ordinary Russians can point to directly and say, this specific fire, this exact loss, is what the war cost me and my family. If you're starting to see how carefully calculated this entire strategy actually is, you're seeing exactly why this channel exists. To connect dots that most mainstream coverage never bothers to connect at all, buried as they usually are underneath surface-level headlines. If this analysis is genuinely helping you understand what's actually happening beneath the noise, drop a comment telling me what surprised you most about this, and consider subscribing so you don't miss the next piece of this unfolding story as it develops. Let's go even deeper into why this particular pressure point cuts so much closer to the bone than anything Ukraine has attempted before this campaign began. Every authoritarian system, no matter how powerful and unshakable it looks from the outside, ultimately runs on an unspoken bargain struck quietly between the government and its own population. In Russia's case, that bargain has always been fairly simple to describe, even if it's rarely stated out loud in official language. Stay quiet, stay out of politics, avoid asking too many uncomfortable questions, and in exchange, your daily life will remain stable and predictable. Your job will still be there tomorrow morning. Your local shop will still have what you actually need on its shelves. Your family's basic routine won't be disrupted by decisions made far away behind closed doors in Moscow. For years, that bargain largely held steady, even as the war ground on relentlessly in the background of daily life. Soldiers were sent to fight and sometimes never returned. Families in distant, poorer regions grieved quietly, largely out of view of the bigger cities. But for the vast majority of ordinary Russians living comfortably in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, daily life continued much as it always had before the invasion began. Shops stayed open late into the evening. Deliveries arrived reliably on schedule. Restaurants stayed busy on weekends. The war existed mainly on television screens and in occasional news segments, not in anyone's actual lived day-to-day experience. What Ukraine has effectively done with this warehouse campaign is quietly break that entire bargain apart, piece by piece, without ever needing to strike a single civilian target directly or cross a clear moral line. By hitting the exact infrastructure that keeps ordinary commerce running smoothly behind the scenes, Ukraine has found a way to make the war genuinely impossible to ignore without ever needing to target civilians themselves in the process. The targets remain commercial logistics facilities, dual-use infrastructure with legitimate, defensible military adjacent functions tied to Russia's broader supply chain. But the consequences land squarely on ordinary daily life anyway, spreading outward through communities in ways that are impossible to fully contain or explain away. And that precise combination is exactly what makes this campaign so uniquely effective at generating lasting political pressure. Think about how differently this compares to more traditional forms of military pressure applied throughout this war so far. A missile strike on a distant military base generates headlines for a day or two, then largely fades from public consciousness because it doesn't touch most ordinary people's actual daily lives in any meaningful way. A strike on an oil refinery creates genuine fuel shortages that frustrate people standing in line at the pump. Real frustration worth taking seriously, but frustration that still feels somewhat abstract, something happening broadly to the country as a whole, rather than something happening specifically and personally to them as individuals. A warehouse fire that destroys a small merchant's entire inventory overnight is different in kind, not merely in degree or scale. That merchant has a name people recognize locally, a face familiar to regular customers, a family depending directly on that income for their next meal and their rent, neighbors who know their personal story intimately, who've bought from their shop for years. When that story spreads through word of mouth, through local social media groups, through small business networks stretching across an entire city or region, it stops being an abstract statistic buried somewhere in a government report about the war. It becomes a specific, deeply personal tragedy that everyone around that person can see clearly, feel emotionally, and relate to immediately in their own lives. Multiply that single story by thousands of merchants spread across dozens of affected regions throughout the country, and you start to genuinely understand exactly why this campaign is generating the kind of visceral, deeply personal anger that fuel shortages alone, however painful, never quite manage to produce on the same scale or with the same emotional intensity. There's also a psychological dimension to all of this that deserves careful, honest attention, because it explains clearly why the Kremlin has struggled so visibly and so publicly to control the narrative surrounding these particular strikes. For years, Russian state media has worked hard and consistently to frame this war as something happening far away, something involving distant soldiers in contested territories, something that doesn't require ordinary citizens back home to sacrifice anything personally beyond paying slightly higher taxes or occasionally feeling a swell of patriotic pride during a carefully staged state parade broadcast on television. That framing works reasonably well as a strategy when the war genuinely stays distant and abstract for most people. It becomes almost impossible to sustain credibly once ordinary people start experiencing direct, tangible personal losses connected unmistakably back to the war itself, with no ambiguity left about the cause. When a small business owner loses everything overnight because a warehouse burned down in a Ukrainian strike, and everyone around them understands exactly why that warehouse burned down and who was responsible, the state's carefully constructed years-long narrative starts to visibly crack under its own accumulated weight. No amount of polished television propaganda can fully paper over a friend, a neighbor, or family member who suddenly lost their entire livelihood overnight, because of a war they never personally asked to be part of in the first place. This is precisely why analysts are increasingly describing this campaign as more politically dangerous to the Kremlin than even the refinery strikes, despite the refinery strikes technically causing more direct economic damage when measured in raw financial terms across the broader national economy. Political danger, it turns out, isn't purely about the raw size of the economic hit involved. It's about how directly, how personally, and how visibly that hit lands on ordinary people's daily lives, and how genuinely difficult it becomes for the government to spin away or explain in a way that doesn't ultimately implicate its own decision to keep fighting this particular war in the first place. There's another layer to this story worth examining closely, one connected directly to how authoritarian political systems typically respond when sustained internal pressure starts building steadily beneath the surface, out of public view. Historically, when a system built tightly around a single dominant leader starts facing this kind of sustained internal pressure over an extended period, it tends to respond in one of a few fairly predictable ways. Sometimes leadership doubles down hard, tightening control even further, increasing censorship across media and social platforms, cracking down harder on any visible form of public dissent, hoping that renewed fear alone can suppress the frustration quietly bubbling beneath the surface before it boils over completely. Sometimes, leadership instead tries to redirect public anger outward, towards some external enemy or foreign scapegoat, hoping that renewed national unity against a common foe can paper over deepening domestic frustration at home. And sometimes, when neither of those familiar strategies fully works as intended, internal factions within the system itself start quietly maneuvering behind closed doors, positioning themselves carefully for whatever comes next, regardless of what the leader at the very top personally wants or believes should happen. The reports we mentioned earlier about Putin tightening his personal security, reducing his public appearances, and spending unusual amounts of time in secure locations away. From public view, all point toward a leader who understands, at some fundamental level, that this particular kind of sustained pressure doesn't behave the same way ordinary political criticism typically does. Ordinary political criticism can usually be managed effectively through carefully curated propaganda, through selective, favorable media coverage, through public appearances specifically designed to project unwavering strength and total stability to the watching public. Economic pain that lands directly on millions of individual households simultaneously is much harder to manage through messaging alone, because that messaging now has to compete directly against something people are experiencing firsthand in their own homes, with their own money, affecting their own families and their own futures. You can tell someone confidently that the war is going well on state television every single night. It's much harder to genuinely convince them that when their own neighbor's business just collapsed overnight because of a warehouse fire that everyone in town already knows the real, unambiguous cause of. This is exactly the vulnerability Ukraine appears to have identified with genuine strategic precision. Not a vulnerability sitting somewhere in Russia's military capacity, which remains formidable and battle-hardened despite years of grinding, costly losses. Not a vulnerability in Russia's demonstrated ability to absorb enormous battlefield casualties, which has proven disturbingly resilient throughout this entire war, month after month. But a vulnerability buried deep within the underlying social contract that keeps Putin's entire system stable and functioning smoothly on a daily basis, the quiet, unspoken agreement that ordinary daily life will remain fundamentally untouched regardless of whatever decisions get made behind closed doors in the Kremlin. Let's talk through the broader economic numbers a bit more carefully now, because they help explain exactly why this particular pressure point matters, as much as it clearly and measurably does. Russia's broader economy has been under sustained, compounding strain for years now, driven by a combination of ongoing international sanctions, the enormous cost of continuous military production, persistent manpower shortages, pulling skilled workers away from civilian industries and into the war effort, rising inflation steadily eating into ordinary household savings, and steadily declining oil revenue as international buyers shift toward alternative suppliers wherever they realistically can. Layer the recent severe fuel crisis on top of all of that accumulated strain, and you get a population already feeling genuinely squeezed on multiple fronts simultaneously, well before any single warehouse ever caught fire in this particular campaign. Refinery strikes created real measurable shortages and pushed consumer prices noticeably higher across the entire country, while simultaneously weakening the government's own revenue base at precisely the moment it needs that revenue most to keep funding an increasingly expensive war effort with no end date in sight. Now overlay the warehouse campaign directly on top of that already fragile, strained economic picture, and you start to genuinely see how quickly these separate pressures compound and reinforce one another, rather than simply adding up in a straightforward, linear, predictable way. Business bankruptcies don't just hurt the individual owners directly affected by a single fire. They ripple outward steadily through the broader economy in ways that take months, sometimes years, to fully show up clearly in official government statistics. Fewer operating businesses means fewer people employed across the country. Fewer people employed means less overall tax revenue flowing into already strained government coffers. Less consumer spending means struggling suppliers further up the chain, and those struggling suppliers eventually mean further layoffs elsewhere along that same supply chain, spreading the underlying damage even wider than it initially appeared. It becomes a slow-moving, cascading effect that continues quietly gathering momentum long after the initial warehouse fire has already faded from that particular week's news cycle entirely. And all of this compounding pressure arrives, while the Russian state still has to keep funding an expensive, ongoing war with absolutely no clear endpoint anywhere in sight. Every single ruble spent trying to stabilize the increasingly restless home front is a ruble that simply cannot be spent on the front line instead. And every ruble spent sustaining the front line is a ruble that cannot be spent addressing the mounting frustration steadily building at home among ordinary citizens. That's an incredibly difficult balancing act to sustain indefinitely without cracks eventually showing, and difficult balancing acts like this one have a well-documented historical tendency to eventually break down under their own accumulated weight, often faster than anyone predicts in advance. If you're finding this kind of layered economic and political analysis genuinely valuable and worth your time, take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button, because understanding exactly how these separate pressures interact and compound together is precisely what separates a surface-level headline scroll from a real, complete understanding of where this entire war is actually heading next. Now let's talk honestly and carefully about where this pressure campaign might realistically be heading from here, and what it would actually take for it to genuinely threaten Putin's grip on power in a lasting, structural way rather than just a temporary dip in a poll. It's important to stay grounded here and avoid overstating what a single strike campaign, however clever and genuinely effective it appears to be, can realistically accomplish entirely on its own. Authoritarian systems, especially ones as deeply entrenched and carefully constructed as Russia's current political structure has become over the past 2 decades, tend to be significantly more resilient than outsides. Observers often expect at first glance, precisely because they're deliberately built with multiple overlapping layers of control, specifically designed to absorb and manage exactly this kind of sustained internal pressure without breaking. Security services remain firmly loyal to the current system, at least for now, based on everything currently visible. State media continues to maintain a powerful, near-total monopoly over the information most ordinary Russians actually consume day to day across television and increasingly monitored online spaces. And genuine, organized political opposition inside the country has been so thoroughly suppressed and dismantled over the past decade that no clear, coordinated alternative currently exists to meaningfully challenge Putin's continued rule in any organized, structural way. But resilience against sustained pressure isn't the same thing as complete immunity to it, and it's genuinely worth being precise and careful about that important distinction. And what we're actually watching unfold right now is less a single dramatic, sudden collapse and more a slow, steady erosion of the underlying trust and social stability that Putin's entire system has always quietly depended on to function smoothly day after day. Approval. Ratings sliding steadily to their lowest recorded point across the entire war. Public commentary growing noticeably bolder and more openly critical than it's been in years, even in spaces once considered too dangerous for that kind of honesty. Reports of a leader who appears to be behaving with increased caution and visibly heightened personal security, whatever the precise underlying reason for that caution, actually turns out to be when the full picture eventually emerges. None of that necessarily means collapse is genuinely imminent, and it would be irresponsible and misleading to claim otherwise with any real confidence at this stage. But it does mean something has genuinely shifted in the underlying dynamic between the Kremlin and its own population, something worth watching very closely in the months ahead. For years, the working assumption inside the Kremlin was fairly straightforward and simple. Ordinary Russians would tolerate this war so long as it stayed sufficiently distant from their own daily lives and personal finances. Ukraine's warehouse campaign, combined with the ongoing fuel crisis and the broader economic strain surrounding both, has directly and measurably challenged that core assumption in a way that's now showing up clearly and consistently in the actual polling data itself, week after week. Whether that steady erosion eventually translates into something genuinely larger, whether it produces meaningful policy changes inside the government, real internal political maneuvering among competing factions, or something even more consequential further down the road, remains genuinely uncertain right now, and anyone claiming to know exactly how this ultimately plays out with total confidence is overstating what the available evidence can actually support at this particular moment. But uncertainty about the exact outcome doesn't mean the underlying trend itself isn't entirely real and worth taking seriously. And right now, that trend is unmistakably pointing in one clear, consistent direction, week after week, poll after poll. There's also a broader strategic lesson buried inside all of this that extends well beyond this single specific conflict, one genuinely worth sitting with for a moment before we close things out. For years, conventional military thinking assumed that the most effective way to pressure a determined adversary was through direct strikes against purely military targets, weapons depots, command centers, troop concentrations, the traditional building blocks of battlefield strategy that military academies have taught for generations across the world. What Ukraine has demonstrated through this particular warehouse campaign, and through the broader deep strike campaign surrounding it, is that carefully targeted economic and psychological pressure, applied with real precision against carefully chosen civilian-adjacent infrastructure, can sometimes generate political consequences that pure military pressure alone simply cannot reliably achieve on its own, no matter how sustained or intense that military pressure becomes. That's a lesson that military planners and political analysts around the world are almost certainly studying very closely right now, regardless of exactly how this particular war in Ukraine ultimately concludes in the end. In an era where authoritarian systems increasingly depend on maintaining a careful, curated illusion of normal, stable daily life for their own populations in order to stay in power, targeting the underlying infrastructure that quietly sustains that illusion can prove remarkably more effective over time than targeting the military hardware that sustains the actual war effort itself on paper. Let's bring this all the way back to where it started now, because the full picture here is genuinely worth holding in your mind all at once, as one complete, connected whole rather than a series of disconnected headlines. Ukraine appears to have identified something that many outside observers spent years assuming simply didn't exist anywhere within Russia's current political system. A genuine, exploitable weak point sitting not out on the battlefield, but embedded deep within the underlying social contract that quietly keeps the entire government functioning smoothly on a daily basis. The unspoken illusion that ordinary Russians could quietly support this war, or at minimum simply tolerate it passively from a comfortable distance, without ever having to personally pay any meaningful price for that support. As warehouses continue burning across multiple regions of the country, as small businesses collapse one after another with no compensation in sight, as fuel remains scarce and increasingly expensive at the pump, and as daily life for millions of ordinary Russians continues steadily deteriorating in ways that are now becoming genuinely impossible to fully hide, deny, or explain away on state television, that carefully maintained illusion is visibly failing in real time, right in front of everyone watching closely, both inside Russia and around the world. Putin's entire system of control has always rested on three interconnected pillars, working together in careful harmony: economic and social stability, holding daily life together, quiet public fear of consequences for stepping visibly out of line, and widespread public passivity born from the reasonable, long-held belief that nothing meaningful could actually be changed anyway, even if someone genuinely tried. Ukraine's current strategy appears to be applying sustained, calculated pressure against all three of those foundational pillars simultaneously, rather than picking just one to focus on exclusively the way earlier strike campaigns often did. And the resulting anger now surfacing openly across Russian social media, in bolder public commentary, and increasingly in official polling data itself, suggests that Russia may genuinely be edging closer to some form of open internal reckoning than it has been at any single point since this entire war first began years ago. Nobody can say with real, honest certainty exactly what comes next, or precisely when it might arrive, or in what specific form it eventually takes shape when it does. History rarely announces its exact turning points clearly and loudly in advance, and anyone claiming otherwise with total confidence is almost certainly overselling what they actually, genuinely know for sure at this stage. But history does consistently leave behind clear, unmistakable warning signs along the way for those willing to look closely and pay careful, patient attention over time. Falling approval ratings that even state media can no longer effectively hide or spin away convincingly. Public commentary growing bolder and more openly critical week after week, in spaces once considered untouchable. A leader who appears to be behaving with visibly increased caution around his own personal safety and daily security. And an economy stretched thin enough now that even ordinary daily commerce is starting to buckle noticeably under the accumulated strain of years of war. Those are exactly the kinds of warning signs genuinely worth watching closely in the weeks and months still ahead. Not because they guarantee any particular outcome with total certainty, but because they tell you, with real clarity and real weight, that something inside Russia's political system has genuinely shifted in a meaningful, measurable way. And that shift didn't happen by pure accident or random coincidence. It happened because someone found a genuinely clever, precisely calculated way to reach directly past the tanks, past the trenches, and past the carefully managed television broadcasts, straight into the everyday lives of millions of ordinary people who had spent years quietly believing this war would never really touch them personally, no matter how long it dragged on. That, more than any single battlefield victory or territorial gain measured in miles on a map, might end up being the single most consequential strategic move of this entire war. If this analysis genuinely helped you understand something you hadn't fully connected before watching, hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me what part of this surprised you the most, and share it with someone who still thinks this war is only being decided out on the battlefield. I'll see you in the next one.